By the time a narcissist reaches this particular trick, he's already run through nearly everything else: the testing, the escalation, the manufactured urgency, the nostalgic appeals, the triangulation, all of it, deployed across weeks or months, all of it failing against a version of you that genuinely structurally stopped caring. This is what he reaches for after everything else has been exhausted, and it's worth understanding in detail because it's genuinely different from everything that came before it, and it's specifically designed to work on exactly the kind of person who's made it this far. Someone whose empathy is real, whose growth is real, and whose one remaining vulnerability is the thing that made her a good person in the first place. The final trick is this: he stops trying to get you back and starts trying to make you responsible for his suffering. This is worth understanding as categorically different from everything we've discussed in earlier videos throughout this series. Every earlier tactic, the love bombing, the guilt trips, the manufactured urgency, was aimed at restoring the relationship, at getting you to re-engage, at reopening a door you'd closed. This final trick has a different, more subtle goal. It isn't actually trying to get you back anymore. Not really. By this point, some part of his psychology has likely registered, at least partially, that this particular door isn't reopening through any of the usual means. What this trick is actually after is something else, making sure that even in your absence, even in your genuine indifference, you continue to carry weight for him. If he can't have your engagement, he'll settle for your guilt. Here's how this typically unfolds, and it's worth walking through the specific mechanics, because recognizing this pattern in real time is the single most protective thing you can do once you encounter it. It usually begins with a shift in the content of whatever contact still occasionally arrives. Not more love bombing, not more nostalgic appeals to what you once had, but something that sounds, on the surface, like vulnerability, admissions of struggling, of not being okay, sometimes explicit statements connecting his current distress directly to your absence. I haven't been sleeping since you left. I don't know how to function without you. I'm really not okay right now, and I don't have anyone else to talk to about it. This is worth understanding at a deeper level because it's genuinely different from the earlier, more obviously manipulative appeals we've discussed. It doesn't ask you to come back. It doesn't ask for anything specific at all on the surface. What it does is quietly, carefully position your continued absence as the direct cause of his suffering, without ever making an explicit request you could clearly identify and decline. This is precisely what makes it so effective against someone whose empathy is genuinely intact. It doesn't trigger the same recognizable manipulation detection instincts that a more obvious guilt trip or demand might trigger, because it isn't structured as a request at all. It's structured as information, delivered in a tone of quiet suffering, seemingly requiring nothing from you except the natural human response of caring that someone is in pain. Here's why this specific trick works so well, precisely at this late stage, against exactly the kind of person who's made it this far in her own healing. Every earlier tactic failed because your growth had specifically inoculated you against it. You'd built genuine indifference to guilt trips, genuine boundaries against manufactured urgency, genuine trust in your own perception against attempts to reframe reality. This final trick doesn't target any of the vulnerabilities you've already closed. It targets something you were never actually supposed to close in the first place, and never should: your genuine, intact capacity for compassion, even for someone who's hurt you badly. This is worth understanding as the actual deeper mechanism behind why this particular trick tends to succeed, at least partially, even against people who've genuinely successfully resisted everything else. Earlier tactics worked by exploiting vulnerabilities that healthy boundaries are specifically supposed to close: susceptibility to guilt you haven't earned, susceptibility to manufactured urgency, susceptibility to having your own perception reframed by someone else's confident insistence. Genuine healing closes these vulnerabilities, and rightfully so, because none of them were ever actually serving you. This final trick is different because it targets your compassion, a capacity that healthy boundaries should never fully close, because compassion for people who are genuinely suffering, even people who've hurt you, is part of what makes you the kind of person worth being in the first place. This creates a genuinely difficult bind, and it's worth naming it directly rather than pretending the answer is simple. If you feel nothing at all when someone expresses genuine sounding distress, even someone who's harmed you significantly, something about that response would actually be worth examining honestly, not because you owe them anything, but because complete indifference to another human being's suffering, even a person who's caused you real harm, isn't actually the healthy end state this entire series has been describing throughout every video we've discussed together. The goal was never to become someone incapable of feeling anything when someone else is in pain. It was always to build discernment about what that feeling requires of you, if anything at all. Here's where the actual answer to this specific trick lives, and it's worth understanding it precisely because it's more nuanced than simply ignore it or don't care, neither of which fully addresses the genuine bind this tactic creates. The answer isn't to stop feeling compassion when you encounter this kind of message. It's to hold that compassion alongside a separate, equally clear piece of information. His distress, even if genuinely real, is not evidence that you're responsible for resolving it. And it's not evidence that re-engaging with him would actually help him in any lasting way, even if it might provide temporary relief. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth walking through why, because it explains exactly how to hold both truths simultaneously without either one canceling out the other. You can genuinely believe that he might be struggling, that his distress might not be entirely performed, that some real human suffering might exist underneath this message, and you can, at the exact same time, recognize that your re-engagement was never actually going to resolve that suffering in any lasting way. This connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier video in this series. Engaging with a narcissist's genuine distress doesn't actually help him process or move through it. It simply, temporarily, restores the specific external input his psychology depends on, delaying whatever internal reckoning might eventually need to happen instead of ever actually contributing to it. This is worth understanding through a specific, honest reframe. Responding to this final trick isn't actually an act of compassion, even though it might feel like one in the moment. It's an act of enabling a pattern that has never once, across the entire history of this relationship, produced any lasting resolution for him, while costing you significantly every single time you've provided it. Genuine compassion in this specific situation doesn't actually look like re-engaging. It looks like something quieter and, in its own way, more difficult, holding real sorrow that someone you once loved is suffering, without believing that your suffering alongside him or your re-entry into his life is actually the thing capable of helping him in any way that matters. Here's what this actually looks like in practice when this final trick arrives and you're trying to navigate it honestly without either performing coldness you don't genuinely feel or collapsing into re-engagement, intellectually won't actually help. The most honest response is often simply not to respond at all, not out of punishment and not out of practiced indifference, but out of genuine recognition that nothing you could say in response would actually change anything meaningful, and that your silence in this specific instance isn't cruelty. It's simply an accurate reflection of the fact that you are not, and never were, the source of the healing he actually needs, regardless of how convincingly his distress gets connected to your absence. If you find yourself needing to hold something internally in response to this message, because complete emotional flatness genuinely isn't required and pretending otherwise would be dishonest, it might sound something like this: I hope he finds real help from people and resources actually capable of providing it. I'm not the source of that help, and I never was, even when I was still in his life trying desperately to be. My absence isn't what's hurting him. Whatever's happening inside him predates me, and it will continue regardless of whether I respond to this message or not. There's one more layer worth understanding about this final trick because it explains something that can feel genuinely confusing if you experience it. Why does it sometimes arrive not once, but repeatedly, spaced out over weeks or months, each instance slightly different in its specific framing but carrying the exact same underlying function? This repetition is worth understanding as its own significant piece of information because it reveals something important about what's actually happening beneath the surface of each individual message. Each time this trick gets deployed and fails to produce re-engagement, it doesn't simply disappear from the toolkit. It gets refined slightly based on what didn't work the previous time. If a direct statement about not sleeping didn't produce a response, the next attempt might shift towards something more specific, a reference to a shared memory, woven into the same underlying structure of connecting his distress to your absence. If that doesn't work either, the framing might shift again, sometimes towards something that sounds less like personal suffering and more like concern about his own future, his own capacity to trust again, his own fear that you've changed him for the worse in some way that requires your continued involvement to somehow undo. Each variation is still, underneath its specific wording, the exact same trick, positioning your engagement as the missing ingredient in his well-being without ever quite framing it as a direct, refusable request. This is worth understanding because it means your response to the first instance of this trick genuinely matters for how many more times it gets attempted and in what form. If it succeeds even once, if a single instance of this framing produces genuine, sustained re-engagement, you've provided exactly the confirmation his psychology needs to keep refining and redeploying this particular approach indefinitely, because it will have proven definitively that this specific tool, unlike everything that came before it, actually still works. If it consistently fails to produce engagement, regardless of how many different forms it takes, eventually, and this varies considerably depending on the individual, the attempts tend to taper off, not because the underlying distress has necessarily resolved, but because the specific strategy of connecting that distress to your absence has been thoroughly, repeatedly tested and found to produce nothing. Here's what I want you to understand as we bring this discussion to its conclusion, because it's the piece that matters most, more than any specific detail about how this trick operates or how many times it might get deployed before it finally stops. You are allowed to feel compassion for someone's genuine suffering without believing that compassion obligates you to re-enter a relationship that caused you real, significant harm. These two things are not in conflict, no matter how much this final trick is specifically designed to make them feel like they are. Your empathy is not a debt he's owed simply because he's suffering. It never was, even during the relationship itself, and it certainly isn't now in its aftermath, regardless of how genuinely his distress might be. This is worth understanding as the actual final lesson underneath everything we've discussed throughout this entire series. Your empathy was never meant to function as an obligation, extracted automatically whenever someone else's pain gets positioned convincingly enough in front of you. It was always meant to be something you offer freely, deliberately to people and situations that actually deserve it, and that your engagement can actually meaningfully help. A narcissist's distress, connected specifically and repeatedly to your absence, does not meet that standard, regardless of how genuinely painful that distress might be for him to experience. If this final trick arrives in your life, whether once or repeatedly, I want you to remember everything this entire series has built toward across every video we've discussed together. You can hold real human sorrow that someone you once loved is struggling. You can hope, genuinely, that he eventually finds real help from people and resources actually capable of providing it. And you can, at the exact same time, hold complete clarity that none of this requires your re-engagement, your response, or your continued emotional investment in order to be true. Your absence isn't cruelty. It's simply the natural, complete boundary of someone who finally fully understands that she was never actually responsible for holding up a structure that was never hers to carry in the first place. He may try this trick once. He may try it many times in many different forms across many months or years. Either way, your answer was always going to be the same, not because you've hardened yourself against feeling anything at all, but because you've finally fully learned the difference between genuine compassion and the specific, exhausting obligation this particular tactic has always been designed to disguise itself as. That difference, once learned, doesn't require relearning every single time this trick resurfaces. It simply becomes quietly and permanently who you already are.